Okay, continuing on with evolution. Um, well, evolution explains the diversity of life, and we know already that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and there is fossil evidence of the prokaryotes. And the prokaryotes are the single celled organisms, the simplest of the single celled organisms. And although they are capable of carrying out protein synthesis and cellular respiration, they are quite simple. But they suggest that where they live, the prokaryotes, that life began in the water. Okay, we already know a little something about the proof of evolution, or the evidence, which is the fossil formation, and that the way fossils are formed is different ways. Organisms can become encased in sap, and then the sap hardens. Tissues become frozen after death. And there's also sedimentation, which covers plants and animals. And also sedimentation occurs in the water. Okay, what happens is that the organism becomes covered and the soft tissues will decay, and then minerals are going to get deposited and replace the teeth and the shells or the bones, making solid casts, depending on the structure of the organism. Okay, well, who are the main players in evolution? Well, first we have George Cuvier, and he studied paleontology, which is the study of fossils, and he looked at the sedimentary rock layers. And he said that there's a succession of the different species in the layers over time, okay? In other words, there's going to be one species that are buried, and then life begins again, and another species gets buried. And so you have this different layers, okay, different layers of the organisms that are trapped over time. And he said, but this was due to something called catastrophism. In other words, natural disasters would occur and kill off the species in an area. So, for example, maybe a volcano would erupt and the lava would bury all the species. And so they would become fossilized. Then new species moved in to repopulate the habitat, and they lived on top of those organisms that had died off. Okay, and so now we have another layer of organisms. Okay, and then perhaps there's another catastrophic event, and then the new species get buried. Okay, so George Cuvier, he spoke about catastrophes to explain the different species which appeared over time. Okay, next comes Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck said, well, life evolved along with the Earth. And what he said was that an organism will evolve new traits in response to their needs. So, for example, okay, if you want to be nice and strong, because maybe your lifestyle requires that, okay, you might want to become a bodybuilder. Okay, now, that's very nice. But this is not going to be passed off to your offspring. Okay? If you make your muscles nice and big and work out all the time and have children, your children are not going to be born muscular, okay, unless they go to the gym. Okay, this trait is not passed on. So something that you are going to acquire during your lifetime or change, or if you stretch your earlobe to put an earring into it, you know, a big circular earring, you know, your children are not going to be born with gigantically large earlobes, okay? So he said that beneficial qualities were passed on directly to the young, but of course this doesn't happen, okay, cannot occur. So, and the example of the bodybuilder is a good example. Okay, if you develop your muscles and they're very well defined, this doesn't mean that your children or your son or even your daughter would be born with bulky muscles. Okay. Okay. So now we have Charles Lyell, and he studied geology, and he has the theory of uniformitarianism. And this means that the shaping of the Earth's features is going to occur by a slow process. Lyell was not looking for such big events like Cuvier to explain how things change, but rather he said that the Earth's features change slowly by forces that are still in operation today. So, for example, we know that the tides will erode the beaches, okay, and windstorms will cause other kinds of damages. So these forces that occur are going to slowly change the Earth. He was a geologist. Okay, so that kind of makes sense, you know, that the Earth's features are going to occur by a slow process. Okay, so it comes up with this idea. It had nothing to do with evolution, but he kind of makes this statement. Okay, James Hutton, along the same time, talked about an ancient Earth. But then comes along Darwin, and Darwin goes to the Galapagos Islands in 1831, and Darwin observes many odd species, these gigantic turtles, many different types of birds, which are called finches. Well, I think they call them Darwin finches after him. And they all are slightly different because they have different types of beaks. Some have long beaks because maybe they have to dig worms out of the ground. Some have short beaks because maybe they're seed eaters. But there's a great variety of organisms living on this island. And part of the reason was that there really were no predators to any of these organisms. But anyway, he sees a lot of variation in a very small area. So eventually, Darwin forms his hypothesis on evolution in 1836. And he said that small changes over a long period of time bring about great changes in a species. In other words, he is bringing along the same idea that Lyell had about the Earth's features changing with a slow process. He's applying it now to organisms, okay? Small changes over a long period of time will bring about great changes in a species. And so he publishes in 1859, quite a bit later, On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. And the idea is that the evolution of a species was carried out by a process of natural selection. Okay, now at the time, this was not widely accepted. And there was a lot of controversy over this because remember, you had a lot of religious beliefs in this period of time, very strong beliefs, and this was very controversial, this idea. Okay, Alfred Wallace in 1858, he had similar views as Darwin. And Darwin could never explain why these things happened. He understood evolution. He had examples of evolution, but he didn't really know what caused evolution. But in science, things change. And when Gregor Mendel came around, and he was the monk that worked with garden peas, and you've heard of Gregor Mendel, okay, and genetics, okay, and he comes up with the principles of heredity. And what he does, he experimented with these garden peas, and he observed flower traits. He basically came up with the principles of genetics, and he was explaining really what Darwin had observed, because we need to understand DNA and genetics to understand what Darwin is saying with his theory of evolution. Okay, and then comes Thomas Hunt Morgan, and he revealed the chromosomal theory of inheritance. Now, by understanding genetics, it's possible to understand natural selection. First of all, with reproduction, more organisms are born than the environment can support. Okay? Resources are limited. There's competition for resources. Predation limits the number of surviving offspring. And only the individuals that are best adapted to their environment are capable or are able to obtain resources, survive, and reproduce. So those traits then that enhance survival become more common in the population. In other words, in the gene pool of the population. And so the genes that code for these traits get passed on to the next generation. So the basics of heredity are that the gene is the basic unit of heredity. Genes are distinct segments of DNA. Each strand of DNA is wound into a chromosome. The chromosomes are comprised of many different genes, and all chromosomes have the identical chemical makeup. However, the differences are in the sequencing of the chemicals, which are nucleic acids. We haven't talked about that group of molecules yet, but that's the fourth important molecule in biology, the nucleic acids, and that's what makes up DNA, but we'll discuss those in detail a little bit later. But in any event, we don't need to go there yet. Genotype is the genetic makeup of an individual, and the phenotype is the physical characteristics or the visible physical characteristics of the offspring. So everybody has a genotype and a phenotype. Okay? In other words, you have a genetic makeup, your genes, okay? And they actually determine your phenotype, what you look like, the physical characteristics. A mutation is a change in the genetic sequence in the sperm or the egg cell, and then it's passed on to the offspring. So there's different ways to acquire beneficial characteristics.